Fiona, I would be really interested to understand, in a university context, you've worked for over 10 years in universities trying to bring this to life. How is it different in a university than it might be in a business to embed the circular economy and engage colleagues?
Well, I guess when I started this journey, I used to think that universities were vastly different from business. However, on reflection and through experience of talking to business, I think there are actually quite a lot of similarities. I suppose one of the biggest differences is the organisational structure. Traditionally, universities are structured in very discipline-specific silos, and therefore when you're trying to get a cross-disciplinary, pan-university kind of system-level project off the ground, such as the development of a new master's course, for example, it's really difficult to break down those barriers between silos. And I think one of the key things that I tried to do to get over that barrier was really to explain what the value of circular economy was to those different disciplines. So whether I was talking to engineering, water science or management, it was trying to resonate with different academics within those disciplines so that they had that overall understanding of where the value was.
And can you give us some examples, like how do you articulate the value in an academic context?
So I think really you have to speak to the individual. Academics are driven by many different things, whether it's publishing, research, or whether it's teaching. And so I think it's, for example, demonstrating the need for new skills and capabilities for our future leaders to enable the transition towards a circular economy is key. There's endless opportunities for research in this space. So it's really trying to understand the person and where their interests lie to bring out kind of the stories of why they should engage with circular economy.
Yeah, thanks. That makes lots of sense. And I guess it does really relate to your experience in a business context as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's you have the buy-in to the idea of the circular economy. Almost always. I mean, people tend to not say, no, I don't want to, create a world in which we'll actually survive, beyond the end of this century. But so very rarely do people say, oh, no, it's not a good idea. But very rarely is it the case that the business solution to that, the business solution to acting in that space and trying to drive circular economy innovation, for example, that's so far from obvious. It's crazy. So you've got this buy-in, but then you unless you can quickly show how there is going to be business value in exploring even, is there a future for us in this space? Then it's kind of pointless. So you've got this initial enthusiasm, then this kind of the reality often sort of hits. Well, how on earth do we do this when we're a business at the end of the day? The people that pay us and pay our salaries, our clients, they're struggling to embrace this. So we may well have to reinvent the way ourselves as a professional service firm or creative services firm operate in this market when there isn't really a market yet. And how do we help these client organisations not only start to see some value in it, but actually just potentially go beyond the incremental, because we're all desperate to see this idea of the circular economy, accelerate towards it. I mean, we have to accelerate towards it. So there are all these huge tensions, but it all starts in a good place. People go, that's a really good idea. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then where do you go from there? Because you just outlined quite a few different points in terms of some of the struggles that organisations go through. And I think even within IDEO itself, which is gone from circular economy not being integrated at all into the sort of way that you're operating as a consultancy, to now being a sort of major theme that you're driving right across the organisation. So you talked a bit there about actually creating markets. If there isn't a basis of analysis and data to prove the economic rationale specifically for your industry, because there is some data around that for some industries, but if it's literally starting from a point of there isn't a clear market for this and you're trying to create a market, what's the process in doing that?
Yeah, it's definitely a case of sort of you have to get good at building the plane as you're going down the runway, basically. So you've really got to start to build these positive feedback loops and experiences for yourself and for your team and for your organisation trying this stuff, and it's definitely definitely something that has to be, you have to start to develop a thick skin. So basically, you've got your idea of what you want to do. You know your organisation's committed to having impact in this space. But then, as we said, like a big question of how. So how do you building that path is kind of definitely about trying things, putting things out into the market to get that feedback, and building roadway. And building roadway is about, I think, a few things. It's about you have to have some level of permission to experiment. So there has to be an implicit understanding that you're going to try some things and they're not going to work out. And I think without that, it's really, really hard. But generally, people aren't given a carte blanche. So there's some level of permission that you have to experiment. But equally, you have to get really good at showing some early promise. So you really, really have to understand. And I think it shows my age here, but I love to go back to this quote by Clint Eastwood in Magnum Force. This is a detective, plays Dirty Harry, and he says a man's got to know his limitations, and it's really, really important to know what the constraints are that you're working with. What is the business reality you have to work with? And if you can really get to the bottom of that, that starts to help you build some roadway. And that becomes then linked into the getting more permission to keep trying this stuff. So what's the business reality? What are the needs of your organisation? What are the needs of the market? Maybe more optimistically, you might say, what are the opportunities in the market? What opportunities do I see to start to shift my organisation? But essentially managing the tension between those needs, those different sets of needs, and the thing you're trying to achieve. And starting to put in place some early experiments that allow you to start to sort of show some value back, a quick feedback loop. And as long as you can show you're continuously learning and you're making those early experiments as sort of, yes, there might be a failure, but they're a win in this sense. We're continuously learning, and you can show that story of learning. That's sort of fundamentally important to building the roadway, which is allowing you to get better at understanding all the time how you can have impact. So as you're building more roadway, you should be the level of return and success you're getting should be going up.
Fiona, can you give an example at Exeter that demonstrates that? So what's the position of strength that's allowed Exeter to now be a sort of academic leading institution in the circular economy?
Sure. So one of our big ambitions is to develop educational programmes for current and future leaders in the circular economy. And we've had some real success with the masterclass that we've developed. We are now into our 5th cohort with over 350 people, executives, professionals that have been through that course. And actually that really helps us when we're developing new programmes that don't necessarily have a traditional market, where the outcome is perhaps a bit unclear. Actually using the masterclass to demonstrate that there's obviously an appetite for people. People are really enjoying being on it. They're getting a lot of value out of it. So we can start to use that as like you said earlier, campaigning from a position of strength, something that we're succeeding in, to then demonstrate how we can develop new programmes.
Yeah, and Chris, how about from your side? What's an example that you've been working on?
Yeah, so we've been looking for a long time. We have this collab platform where we bring together a number of organisations across the value chain. In this case, in fashion is where we started. So that actually was a little convergence point. We said, let's just look at fashion, see what we can do there. And started to look at a whole range of different circular business models with a range of actors, a range of players in the industry value chain. And we're looking at early venture opportunities for them, and actually kind of got to the point through this kind of understanding the system, looking at innovation opportunities around the value chain in fashion, saw that there was actually some critical sort of missing infrastructure. So we thought, well, that's really interesting. How could we drive this infrastructure to the marketplace? And so we actually looked at, for example, what would we unlock in terms of new user behaviours, new behaviours within fashion providers, and actually how could we fuel new kinds of services coming to the market if we put usage data around clothing actually out there. So if you could start to monitor the circularity and the utilisation of clothing and put that out there, how could you fuel lots of businesses that are trying to provide fashion as a service, for example, where at the point of purchase, those service providers can say, okay, well, you hardly wear this, this? Do you want to resell it? Here's a marketplace, or buy something that's already been worn, pre-loved, or do you want to rent something? So if you have that data, you can make you can fuel circularity essentially, because it becomes much more easy and valuable for the user to kind of monetize and get more out of their clothing and their wardrobe. Fashion providers can shift more easily into fashion as a service. So it's starting to fuel the behaviour of circularity in the industry. So that would be an example of something which in a way is a super specific venture in what it's trying to achieve, but hopefully creates the conditions for circularity to pick up in an industry.
Yeah.
And so we're super focused on delivering that, which compared to, IDEO is in every industry in the world. We have 23 different design disciplines, innovation. We're going from everything from health systems to mobility systems. So this feels like sort of highly, highly specific, given that circular economy also spans that whole remit, right? And so we're trying to just, again, prove out that we have found a way of understanding a system, identifying points of, where we could act as a service provider in that industry by convening and helping them design together and co-create, and then also, that we could show value to the actors in the market. And so that I suppose is where we found a kind of scale to work at.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I've had is, ironically, actually communicating what the circular economy is to people, because I think particularly now that we're kind of 10 years into transformational change, people think, they have their own perception of what circular economy is, and I think there's a risk that you can operate on the level that you just assume we're all talking about the same thing. And actually I realised kind of probably halfway through trying to develop a master's course that some people were talking about actually something quite different, and so I had to actually run a workshop on Circular 1.0 to say these are the key principles of circular economy. This is kind of the common mindset that I'm hoping that we can all adopt. And actually that took a bit of courage, I think, because particularly when you're working with professors who have been developing their expertise, in their subject area for a long, long time, to actually bring them back and say, well, what is it that we're looking at? Where do we start from? Developing some of the foundations is really important.
One of the points is around experimentation, and how do you actually create a culture of being able to experiment? Maybe Fiona, we can start with you, because universities maybe culturally, I'm assuming, don't necessarily always have that in place. So how do you go about kind of campaigning for that more experimental mindset?
I think it comes back to the point we were making earlier about scale and not trying to strive for something too ambitious too soon, so experimenting on a small scale. And an example of this that we did when we were developing a master's course was we started to experiment just on the individual class scale or even a module scale, so to test out some new ideas within a small seminar, for example, and to reflect on that and get feedback from that and then share that with others. To enable that experimentation and for people to see how it was working before we then started scaling it up to bigger programs.
And I think one of the things our listeners are quite keen to understand is what are the skill sets that actually they really need to develop in order to be able to go through this process of change within organisations. So if you can give some examples of what you think you've had to develop as individuals, what has helped you and what has maybe hindered you in your own journey in this space.
Yeah. I think one of the key things for me is communication, being able to articulate the narrative around circular economy, getting people to buy into it and understand the value for them, but also identifying that you need to communicate that story differently depending on your audience and depending on the level that person is that you're talking to. So, for example, we've been really lucky at Exeter in that we've got very senior buy-in from the Dean of the Business School, David Allen, which is fantastic, and I think that's really important, but you also need to bring along others, peers and colleagues on that journey. So I think skills such as persuasion, being able to communicate the narrative effectively, patience as well. It's not all going to happen immediately. You need to bring, as I said, people along on the journey that will take quite a long time probably.
And what do you do when people aren't receptive?
I think it's a matter of communicating the story perhaps in different ways, through different media, but also relying on the huge body of knowledge that there is out there from business, from yourselves, with your resources that you mentioned. It's not just coming from me, it's explaining that, you know, there's plenty of other organisations that are putting the circular economy at the heart of their strategy, at the heart of innovation. And so as a university, if we're not doing this, then we're going to get left behind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And Chris, how about from your side?
Yeah, I was just thinking actually kind of how I got in. Part of the reason I kind of got into circular economy was actually I'd been doing the kind of job I've been doing for a number of years, and I kind of just thought to myself, it wasn't like a midlife crisis, but it was, if I just keep just doing what I'm doing, I'm kind of taking like no risks around anything. I'm just like becoming a sausage machine. So I wanted to, I suppose, do something where I was kind of pushing, like, you know, my own, you know, sense of risk taking a little bit more. I mean, nothing crazy, but it was like compared to just kind of you know, the same old. And so that was definitely that. You find you attract people like that actually when you start working in it. And then I think you have to get really good at embracing ambiguity, because compared to the sausage machine job you did before, what you didn't realise when you're doing the sausage machine is kind of how satisfying it is to actually be able to complete tasks and get something done and finished and kind of. So you have to kind of really embrace not having the magic formula to success for quite a long time, and maybe even never having it with something that's still in the grand sense so emergent in the world, right? So I think that's kind of, it's a very different type of satisfaction, and you don't get that closure perhaps you would otherwise have got before, maybe. And so I think that's an interesting thing. And just that kind of, as I said, I mentioned it before, like no one's going to thank you when you're disrupting a lot of stuff. And so, you know, people can quite easily also sort of mischaracterize what you're doing and say that's there to sort of personal mission, they're looking for a platform, you know, all these kind of things organizations like to do around change to kind of push it back out again. And so I think, you know, you have to be very wary of how people are labeling what you're doing as well, and really stand up to that. You know, you have to kind of speak truth to that, because that can derail things as well. So there's a few, you know, like the psychology of it all is fascinating.